Hey everyone. Um, so the teaching team, I believe, is going to be starting like a more themed sermon series soon. But this week, like last week when Adam spoke, we're doing a more informal thing of looking at some passages and themes from the post-Easter period in the Bible, as it is indeed right after Easter in the liturgical year for us right now. So this afternoon, I'll be speaking from several scripture passages, starting with two that are from before Easter, but in both cases, it's Jesus speaking to his disciples to prepare them for life and ministry without his physical company there with them. So the one I want to start with is in Matthew 24. And this whole chapter, as well as the next one, which I won't cover at all, but the whole two chapters together are called the Little Apocalypse, because here Jesus gives his disciples some warnings about troubles to come. And it's little because it's much smaller than the book of Revelation. So there's a lot of debate about how to interpret these warnings and what sort of timeline Jesus had in mind for them. But the relevance of the part that I'm going to read tonight doesn't particularly depend on taking a side in those debates, so we won't get into that here. Now, immediately before this part in Matthew 24, Jesus and the disciples are walking around Jerusalem just a few days before the crucifixion, and Jesus just sort of casually points at the Jewish temple there and is like, oh, by the way, this is all going to be torn down. And it's like a big stone building. And so the disciples are understandably confused and probably worried about that. So when they get outside of the city and everyone's sitting down together, they ask him about it and they want to know, what, like, are there signs for us to look for so that when we know that this, life-changing destruction is about to happen? And starting in verse 4, Jesus answers their questions. He says, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Messiah,' and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come." And before I go any further with that, I'm going to read the second passage, which is from Matthew 10. Now, this is when Jesus sends off his disciples to minister on their own for a bit, without him, just sort of around the region. And he's giving them instructions before they go out. And as part of his instructions in verse 16, he says a very famous line that's probably familiar to you: "I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves." Or I think the KJV version, which might be better known as wise as serpents. Now, there's a lot going on in both of these passages, but in each of them, Jesus is concerned that his followers will avoid deception in his physical absence and deception of every nature. So, at the highest level, he wants them to remain faithful to God, to not be led astray by other people falsely claiming to be the Messiah. But he also has more mundane types of truth in mind, right? He says they'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. This is like roughly their analog to the news. And Jesus says, don't be alarmed by it. Now, I don't think he's saying don't be alarmed by actual war coming to where you live, because remember, this is all in the context of preparing for chaotic events. So it's not like Jesus is against getting out of harm's way. But when you're just hearing stories, Jesus says, and the fact that he calls them rumors suggests that some of these may or may not be accurate. When you're just hearing stories, his counsel is to stay calm and to stay focused on the truth. And when Jesus sends out the disciples out to minister on their own in Matthew 10, he tells them to be shrewd in the context of warning that some people will not welcome them or listen to their words, and that some people will respond to them with animosity or outright persecution. And that in the short term, it will deceptively look like those people have won and God's kingdom has been defeated. So, part of being shrewd or being wise then is about remaining hopeful in the truth, because as Jesus says in verse 26 of that chapter of Matthew 10, there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. So the truth will be apparent to everyone eventually. But right now, when it is difficult to see and remember that reality, when you're trying to follow Jesus without having him bodily there to teach and guide you, Jesus says, be shrewd, be wise, be careful that you do not succumb to deception. And this is a warning I think that we need now, specifically, because I would say that our society is in a state called epistemic crisis. And the word epistemic comes from epistemology, which is the study of knowledge itself. So epistemology asks questions like, what do we know? How do we know it? What's the difference between knowledge, opinion, and conjecture? Is the world really as we perceive it? Can we trust our senses? Can we trust our reasoning? Can we trust each other? Or even our own memory? Um, if truth exists, which Christians affirm it does, epistemology asks, can humans access it rightly? Like, is it accessible to us? Now, most of us, most of the time, don't think about epistemology, and we really can't, right? Whatever we believe, we have to live as if knowledge is attainable and as if we, both individually and as the human race, are fairly competent in attaining it. I could never learn a new skill, right? If I spent every moment questioning whether learning is possible. I couldn't write for a living if I wondered if real communication can take place between people. So we have to live like true knowledge can be gained and shared because it's just not really possible to function otherwise in ordinary life. The problem is that it is possible to function otherwise in the public square. And by the public square, I mean politics, the media broadly understood. So that would include social media, basically everything we have in mind when we talk about the discourse or having a national conversation. And in that space, which includes a lot that relates to our faith, that's where I think we have this epistemic crisis, which is to say that I think we have a really hard time knowing what is true, what is knowable, and what is trustworthy. Our whole information environment is very chaotic and overwhelming. It's full of conspiracy theories, it's full of um, actual fake news and fake news. It's a lot of habit forming digital manipulation that we don't even notice. I think it's really messing up our brains. It's making our politics even worse than they already were. And I think it's a challenge for discipleship for us as Christians and even a threat to Christian community. Because when we're deep into epistemic crisis, we start to become incomprehensible to each other because we start to live in different informational realities. We can become very certain about things that don't warrant certainty and doubtful of documented facts. In the throes of epistemic crisis, we look a lot like the fool critiqued throughout the book of Proverbs. The fool is always seeking out information that pleases us, dismissive of wisdom, lacking common sense, quick to quarrel, and far too happy to hear yourself talk. And so the simplest conversations can feel impossible when we're like that, when we can't agree on basic facts. And if we can't talk to each other, then how do we worship together and how do we live together? So Christians are supposed to be people of truth, people who are known for our love. To grow in Christian maturity, Paul wrote in Ephesians 4:14 to 15, is to cease being blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming, and instead learn to speak the truth in love. And that really echoes these warnings that Jesus had when he was preparing his disciples to go on after he had ascended, as Rachel just told us. And so this connection between truth and love, um, and their centrality to the Christian life is really driven home. We've been reading from Matthew mostly, but it's really driven home in the Gospel of John and the Epistle of First John. So John's Gospel starts this theme with that famous opening where Jesus says, "The Word who was with God and was God, and through whom all things are made, and without whom nothing was made that has been made." The Greek word logos, is what we translate as word in that chapter, has a fuller meaning, as its similarity to the word logic suggests. When John calls Jesus the Word, he's describing him as the reason and order of the universe. There was an early church theologian named Justin Martyr, so called because he was in fact martyred, who wrote in Greek and thus was very familiar with this word logos. And he explained that the logos is with God and is begotten before the creation, is the intuition, plan, and human nature of an inexpressible reality. So Jesus, as Logos, Justin said, is the truth by which the whole universe hangs together. And Jesus himself makes this claim about himself as truth in the gospel, later in the Gospel of John, while talking with his critics and his disciples in chapter 14. And in both passages, Jesus connects truth and love, and he describes them as definitional to Christian faithfulness. It says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And his followers are people who will know the truth. Jesus also calls his disciples to live here, promising that in that project of loving, they will be guided by the Holy Spirit, whom he labels here the Spirit of truth. But his opponents are unable to love him, Jesus says, because they don't know God and therefore can't recognize God's truth. If God were your father, you would love me, he says, for I have come here from God. And this is in John chapter 8. He continues, why is my language not clear to you? Because you are unable to hear what I say. You belong to your father, the devil, he goes on, and there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is the liar and the father of lies. So it's precisely because he tells the truth, he says, that these opponents can't understand him. They can't recognize the logos when they encounter it. And the first epistle of John draws this truth, love, faith connection to in a long meditation on the nature and expression of love in chapters 3 and 4. It says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters, not with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. So, as Christians, our faith to the truth should be evidenced in our love, and our love, with God's help, should be expressed in truthfulness. We get a very vivid example of this in Acts chapter 2, which is about the early days of the church after Easter, after Jesus ascended. Those first believers, it says in verses 42 47 of this chapter, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Now, when we've taught this the third way in the past, I think we've tended to focus on what I would call the love parts of it. The community life, how they ate together and had a common purse and sold property to help people in need. But what I want us to notice today is the truth parts, if you will, how they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, and they met every day in the temple courts to talk about the truth of God. So their love for God and one another was organized by the logos, the truth of Christ. And so I want to talk about Jesus's warnings against deception, about epistemology, about the necessary link between truth and love in the Christian life today for three reasons. The first, as I said, is that I really do think this epistemic crisis is a big deal. And I think we're all probably far more vulnerable to it than we realize. If you spend 4 hours on church and the Bible a week and 20 hours on media a week, be that social media, television, super thoughtful think pieces you found on Twitter, whatever, what is winning in your brain? What is having more of an influence on who you are and what you believe the world is like? What we think and talk about shapes who we become. Whenever we give something our attention, we're giving it some small authority of spiritual formation in our lives. And so I think we should be asking, are we watching out that no one deceives us? Are we being as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves? Or are we being blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people and their deceitful scheming? And these are questions I think we should be asking in a lens through which we should examine our content consumption habits, both in terms of the nature of the content and in terms of the portion of our time that we're giving it, as well as how that portion compares to the time we're giving to better things, not least to our faith and discipleship, because the sheer availability of it now really does make this a new situation from what we've dealt with in our own lifetimes in the past. There just was not this kind of accessibility of interesting things to read and watch, even 20 years ago when many of us were young adults or in high school. And the second reason of the three is that, so I've been at Third Way a long time, by Third Way standards anyway, about 7.5 years. And one change that I've observed and that I've talked with the teaching team about, having observed a little bit over those years, is it's both a good thing and I think a bad thing. The good part of it is that we got really good at community life. Third Way is very, very good at being much more than a once a week Bible lecture where you barely know the person in the pew or right now the Zoom box next to you. But the bad thing is that I think we sometimes focus on developing that community life at the expense of attention to the theological distinctives that were core to why Third Way was founded in the first place. And by this, I mean that we've had people come to Third Way because of our community life without so much attention to what we believe to be true. And I want to be really, really clear that I'm not saying that attracting people with good community is bad. That was a big part of the attraction for us when we moved here and knew no one. And Third Way was like instant community and friends. It's a good thing. But it should always be a community in which our love for one another is, as in that description of the early church in Acts chapter 2, organized around the truth of Christ. Giving our attention to that truth, devoting ourselves to the apostles' teaching, not only to fellowship, is more necessary than ever in a time like ours where there is this real risk of epistemic crisis. It is more and more difficult to know what truth is, and Third Way should be a place of knowing truth and learning to parse truth from lies. In Philippians 1 9 through 11, Paul says that his prayer for the church at Philippi is that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. This is that connection of truth and love. And I think it's vital for Third Way to pursue both and to never separate the two, not only to lean into the community fellowship that has become our strength. That fellowship must be love abounding in knowledge and depth of insight. It must be love that acts and speaks in truth. And then the third reason for this message is that what I've been talking about here about the necessity of truth amid epistemic crisis is the last one that I have for Third Way. I'm going to be, as many of you know, signing a contract with a publisher probably this coming week to write about epistemic crisis in American faith and politics for a second book. And to make time for that, I need to step off the teaching team. So this is the last week that I'll be speaking like this. Most or maybe all of you know, I think, that we're moving to Pittsburgh either later this year or early next. So I'd have been stepping down from the team soon anyway, but it's a little bit earlier than I expected. And I'm usually not big on changing life plans rapidly, but this topic of the book and of what I've said today in a much briefer version is important enough to convince me that I should. The nature and scale of our information environment really is unprecedented in human history, and I think our brains are just bad at it. They're just not made for Facebook and Twitter and so on. The word of mouth rumors of wars that Jesus talked about just have nothing on these algorithms serving up content perfectly engineered to obsess and enrage us. And so I think understanding that we're in an epistemic crisis and that we have these legitimately new challenges of understanding truth and of heeding Jesus's warnings to avoid deception, that's extremely necessary in this moment in history. And I'm eager to write about it in greater length, hopefully starting in earnest by the end of this month. So thank you all for hearing me out on this and on so much else over the years. I've been honored to be on the teaching team, and I know that Third Way will be in very good hands with Terry, Chris, and Adam going forward. And now I will open it up, as always, for questions and comments, which you can also type into the chat if you do not want to appear on the recording.
Hey, Bonnie. I just wanted to say that I am really going to miss you on this team. I have really, really enjoyed your contribution here, and I don't think people really grasp what a commitment it is to do that. So I just want to thank you, and I'm really excited for your book. So I'll be looking forward to that.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, guys. And thank you, Karna, for your message in the chat also. All right, well, if there are not any questions, I will hand it back over to Adam.
Man, I was just in my mind formulating so many questions about that sermon. It was great. Thanks, Bonnie. So now well, let's just give people 30 more seconds because that was a lot of information. Speaking personally, I really appreciate that that tension that you highlight between, the truth of Christ and the teachings of the apostles, and how that is in conflict with the ways that we just ingest so much garbage, essentially. And it make I've listened to, speaking of ingesting garbage, I think many of us listen to podcast after podcast, and I'm looking at Mark right now, but I'll leave him alone. uh, but I was reading or listening to a piece about how social media companies think about their product and what they're trying to do, and it's essentially trying to take as much of our attention as possible. And so I really appreciate you calling out the fact that, whatever we give our attention to, we don't necessarily think of that as giving something away, but it really is. And the things that we spend time thinking about and consuming is the word that we use now. But that ends up really forming who we are. And so I just appreciate how you highlight that.
Thank you. There's a quote from, well, I just looked it up. Google telling me it's Ralph Waldo Emerson, but that could be false. But it's to the effect of, I cannot remember the books I've read any more than the meals I've eaten, even so they've made me. And I think that that's true of all the other content that we consume, and we don't necessarily realize it. And I'm just as bad at this as anyone. Like, I would be very embarrassed to show you my phone screen time report.
Okay.
Just wanted to say quick, Bonnie, thank you for all of the work that you put into the teaching team. It's been wonderful to be on the team with you, and we're going to miss you a lot.